Chapter 15. New Outpost and Preserve.
The conquest of the Philippines by the Americans was part of a pattern of expansion that began nearly as soon as the 13 colonies were established. American West began the course of empire, which resulted in the annihilation of the Indians and the abolitions of Spanish control in America. Jefferson, the imperialist, acquired the imperial area that swept the Mississippi to the mountain, from Texas to the British territories, and the march of the flag began, the agrarian South whose culture was the triumph of capitalism on the continent. The victory of the North removed the last significant impediment to capitalist development. Rationalizations of expansionism. Various arguments are made for expansionism. Some called it manifest destiny while others, influenced by social Darwinism, regarded it as an unavoidable result of racial inequality. Capitalism's urge had to lead and would continue to lead to the expansions of the United States. The westward push, the conquest of Spanish and Mexican areas were part of the dynamics of widening and deepening the domestic market. Economic roots. It was a North victory that eventually permitted the full operation of capitalism forces to be restrained by the demands of the South's economy. As a result, the United States experienced fast industrial development. And rise in the output of produced items results in the formation of new markets. Philippine role. At this time, America is figuring out how to receive her fair share. Being a latecomer, Philippines was an answer to its rationale for being able to infiltrate China economically and evangelistically. United establishes a neighboring base in the Philippines, and the islands serve as a launching pad to Asia. Rumors of a Spanish-American war anticipated the American takeover of the island. People believe that American sovereignty would be good to their economic interests. A clash of interest. The interests of first, commerce and commercial holdings overseas, which supported colonialism, and second, those interested in safeguarding local production and labor from foreign competition, which opposed colonization and later pushed for early independence. Senator Samuel McHenry, representing the sugar-growing state of Louisiana, introduced a resolution to the effect that ratification of the treaty with Spain should not be interpreted as granting U.S. citizenship to residents of the Philippines with the goal of annexing the islands. Senator Augustus O. Bacon of the sugar-producing state of Georgia, for his part, suggested an amendment that would pledge the United States to granting the Philippines independence as soon as a stable government was established. The Bacon amendment was lost, but the McHenry resolution passed but did not gain validity as a declaration of policy. Taft's role. William Howard Taft served as President of the Philippines Commission, Civil Governor, Secretary of War, and President of the United States. With such a backdrop, it is no surprise that Taft entirely agreed with the views of large monopoly investment groups and saw it as his responsibility to assist the entry of major exporters, significant investors, and construction corporations into the colony. The Taft Commission strongly advises Washington to enact property and franchise regulations as soon as possible to provide these corporations with the best opportunity for lucrative investments. The real debate. The discussion over ratifying a treaty that had barely emerged a month after the Battle of Manila Bay. The anti-imperialist movement influenced state policy toward the colony in a variety of ways. The victory of an anti-annexation Democratic Party candidate put some pressure on the political electionists' decisions. The reliance that Aguinaldo appears to have in the Democrats is unjustified. During the early years of occupation, political and administrative practices aimed to quell public opposition to colonialism. Appointment of collaborationist ilustrados to high posts in order to symbolize Filipino acceptance of colonial status. The portrayal of resistance leaders as bandits and robbers, as well as the repeated reiteration of America's benevolent goals and independence promises. Filipinos, on the other hand, accept the American domination. The anti-imperialist. Anti-imperialism or annexation opponents. This group is opposed to outright territory conquest. The anti-imperialism that resisted Philippine colonization is not the same as the anti-imperialism that drives national liberation movements in many underdeveloped countries. Most anti-imperialists are neocolonialists. The sole difference between imperialists and numerous anti-imperialists was that time, the former believed in territorial annexation, while the latter believed in economic expansion without seizure of territory. The underlying backbone of the opposition to the acquisition of the Philippines persisted unabated until the colony was granted independence. In search of patron. Because they were aware of America's interest in the Philippines, the Filipino Ilustrados were keen to acquire a foreign sponsor to bankroll their revolution against America's aim as early as 1897. Just before the outbreak of the Spanish War, the Americans started active in making links with Filipino revolutionaries and sending updates on the Philippines' conditions. The Catholic interest. It is the Catholic hierarchy in the United States that encourages the U.S. government to occupy the country. They considered American conquest as the only way to save the Church's immense economic interests in the islands once Spanish sovereignty had collapsed, because if the Americans did not take over, the Philippine revolutionary government would hold power. The abuses of friars had played a significant role in igniting the revolution and its hatred for their religious landlords. Americans hoped to take over from the Spanish clergy in charge of church interests in the Philippines. Philippines for Filipinos. Taft saw the Philippines as a profitable venture. His purpose was to increase American economic control. Running the Philippines for the Filipinos did not grant them freedom or even autonomy. Filipinos were little more than grown-up children to Taft. The successful implementation of the Philippines for the Filipinos would result in a nation of pleased colonials who would not object to the U.S. permanent retention of their country. Servicing the American business. American investors have been putting pressure on the Taft Commission to open the Philippines exploitations as soon as possible. However, the military government lacked the ability to pass laws controlling property and contracts. As a result, Taft advocated for the early creation of civil government. He battled with the military, particularly General Arthur MacArthur, who stated that the Filipinos would require bayonet therapy for at least a decade before peace and order could be restored. Filipino resistance was suppressed by reducing guerrilla combatants to the status of thieves and outlaws in order to construct a civil administration capable of serving eager American merchants. Settling down to business. Assured of protection against competition from either cheap labor or cheap produce, the sectors that have supported the anti-imperialist movement became reconciled to annexation. Moderate anti-colonialists were modified by the limited participation in government granted to Filipinos. The anti-imperialist movement soon died down. Its major concern had scarcely been the freedom and welfare of the Filipino people. Philippine status clarified. What this meant in practice was that while Filipinos swear allegiance to the United States, they were not regarded as American citizens, and Congress could therefore enact special laws governing them which did not affect American citizens. The Cooper Act protectionist triumph. As anticipated in the Spooner Amendment, the U.S. Congress subsequently got around to the business of providing an organic act for the colony. This was the Philippine Assembly as the lower chamber of a bicameral legislature whose upper house was the Philippine Commission. Besides satisfying the prior's establishment by the U.S. President of other instrumentalities of government such as the Philippine Commission, Civil Governor and his subordinates and the Supreme Court, the Organic Act also empowered the Philippines by legislature to elect resident commissioners to the United States. Shouldering the cost of exploitation. Exploitation of the colony involved development of the import-export trade and investment principally in the extractive industries. This ventures required the development of roads and railroads as well as the enactment of legislation regarding trade between the United States and the colony. Therefore, far from being the result of American interest in the welfare of the Filipinos, the road-building program was designed to satisfy American needs. The money to build the road was raised by taxing the Filipinos. It had been decided that the insular government was to be supported entirely by taxes live on the population, hence, all public works and other projects such as those in education and sanitation, not to speak of the government machinery itself, were paid for by the Filipinos. Eliminating competition. Now that the United States government was in a position to aid American traders and investors, it quickly proceeded to eliminate competition by enacting a series of tariff acts. Tariff Acts of 1901 lowered the tariff rates on some types of American exports to the Philippines. The tariff on American goods entering the Philippines. The Payne-Aldrich Act. A few months after the Treaty of Perpetrations lapsed, the U.S. passed the Payne-Aldrich Act. Under this law, all American goods could enter the Philippines free of the duty and in unlimited quantities. The provision of the Payne-Aldrich Act allowing the entry of 300,000 tons of Philippines raw sugar into the United States. Free off duty was no doubt responsive to the desire of the powerful Sugar Trust. Was fairly certain that if it could acquire large tracts of land it could appropriate the lion's share of the quota. Friar lands and sugar investors. The Philippine Commission passed the Friars Land Act, which prescribed the conditions for the sale and list of the friars, state reference to be given to some 60,000 tenants who worked the land. This purchase of the friars' haciendas was a shrewd political move designed to gain the goodwill of the Filipinos and thus help reconcile them to American sovereignty. The land policy. American land policy in the Philippines was conservative. Although the colonial government declared its desire to broaden the base of independent land ownership, American interest clearly lay in not disturbing and indeed in strengthening the system of land ownership that was developed under Spain. The colonial taxation policy favored landowners, agricultural products were underassessed and undertaxed, and collection was notoriously tax. Agricultural products were exempted from any tax assessment in order to encourage export crop production. The Manila American. Aside from their commanding position in the major export industries of the country, American businessmen, either as individual proprietors or as representatives of U.S. firms, dominated the import trade and were active in many other economic fields in the country. Albert L. Emem, who came to Philippines in 1899, set up the first autobus line in Luzon, first in Bicol region and then later in Batangas and Pangasinan. George C. Arnolds, pioneered in the manufacture of coconut oil. The Philippine-based American businessmen, whether they were in business for themselves or acting as agents for big American corporation, grew on wealth and power. There are so-called Manila Americans took a proprietary attitude toward the country, and all throughout the American occupation constituted me of the staunchest pressure groups against Philippine independence. The triumph of American business. The various economic legislations culminating in the establishment of free trade were all designed to produce an economic climate attractive to American traders and investors. The response to the live of profits in the new colony was prompt and strong. Soon, most of the old Spanish and European houses were being replaced by American firms. The Philippines imported manufactured goods and exported raw materials. This was disadvantageous for the country because, relatively speaking, it was buying dear and selling cheap. To make matters cheap, the people shared only minimally in the temporary from periods of their agricultural products, the lion's share of the profit going into the pockets of foreign investors and the rest to the Filipino landowners. A brief survey of the production and investment picture in the major agricultural exports will show the influx of American capital. 1. Sugar. The first modern sugar central is published by American Capital Room after the institution of free trade. This were the Mindoro Sugar Company, which began operating on 1910, and the central in San Carlos Negros Occidental and Calamba, Laguna, which were established in 1912. 2. Copra. The development of the soap and margarine industries abroad stimulated the production and trade in copra. The time World War trade was being supplied by the Philippines. The war created a demand for coconut oil. 3. The hemp bonanza. Hemp was the principal export of the Philippines to the United States until 1912. The early history of the industry provides a graphic example of how big business manipulates government regulations to extract additional profits from a colony. Through the Tariff Act of 1902, Philippine hemp was allowed to enter the United States duty-free, and it that also exempted from paying the usual export taxes upon leaving the Philippines. Consumption's habit. The influx of duty-free American goods drastically changed the consumption habits of the Filipinos and produced bi-stateside mentality with disastrous effects on local production. One notable example is the smoking habits of the Filipinos. During the Spanish occupation, the Filipinos were heavy consumers of Philippine cigars and cigarettes. The era of neo-colonial control of the Philippines and other Asian countries.
That's all. Thank you for watching.